Hey, good morning. This is Pastor Dan with First Alliance Church for our Friday devotional. And I want to keep thinking about this idea of lamenting. This past week, if you listened to this last Sunday's sermon, one of the phrases that I mentioned in there was this idea that perhaps lamenting, our complaint, our grief, our struggle, our sorrow, perhaps our laments are something of such high value that to offer them to the Lord is really an act of worship, even higher than celebrating the joys of God's favor. I think back about how in the Old Testament, even when Adam and Eve were removed from the garden because of their unbelief, because they doubted God's goodness and disobeyed what God had instructed them to do, and they took the fruit, what happened? There was a sacrifice. And the sacrifice was something of value, something God had created. And then we moved to the sacrificial system. What was the role of the sacrifice in the sacrificial system? And why did it have to be the firstborn male that was sacrificed? Because it was a sign of wealth. It was a thing of honor. It was the celebration of the best. Why did a sacrifice have to be the best animal? Why not just give God the smallest, littlest thing? It was going to be killed anyway. And instead of eating it, why not offer it to God? Well, because God is of such value that He wants something of highest value. And so the Israelites, as they brought sacrifices, were to bring something of great value. Something without a spot or a blemish that could be offered. As I think about this idea of offering something that costs us something, I think of David when at the end of 2 Samuel 24, at the end of 2 Samuel, David counted all of the fighting men in Israel, and it displeased God greatly. And so God sent a plague, and then David asked God, how do I remove this thing? And God said, you should go and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And when he went to Araunah the Jebusite and said, can I buy your threshing floor? Araunah said, no, let me give it to you. And David said, no, I won't. Just take it. I insist on paying you for it. Chapter 24, 2 Samuel 24:24. I insist on paying for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for it. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. You know, perhaps you're suffering, and the complaints you feel can be offered to God as something of high value. They certainly are things that are high value to you. And to release them is to suggest that you're giving up on something that you treasure, that you value, that has worth to you. And what better to give God than something of great worth, of great value? You know, perhaps God is more loving and gracious and merciful than we believe He is. And that by giving Him our laments, which are, once again, there are 4 parts to a biblical lament. First is they're to call out to God. The second is to offer our complaint about things that don't line up with the way God's kingdom ought to be working. It might be that we ought to see more healings. We ought to see more people delivered. We ought to see wars stop. We ought to see hunger stopped. We ought to see people that are trapped in bondage with addictions and religiosity, that they ought to be freed. And our third section is a request to ask God, to beg God that He would change these things and free the captive. In fact, that's the reason that Jesus came. You remember in the New Testament when He stepped into the synagogue, He picked up the scroll, and where did He read from? He read from Isaiah. And Isaiah, what was he there to do? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me so that I could preach good news to the poor and free the captives. Free the captives. And then the fourth part is our affirmation of our trust in God. That even if we might not see what we want to see right now, we believe that God is on our side. Not because our side is best, but because we're on His side. And because we're on His side, we want what He wants. We want to care about what He cares about. We want to work toward what He wants to see in the world. And processing our grief and our sorrow and our complaint and our bitterness and our anger and our injustices through a grid of God being for us is what lamenting is all about. So I don't know what you're up against today, or how the war in Ukraine has hit you, or how our circumstances this rainy day has hit you. But beloved, I want to remind you that God is for you. That Jesus came because He wanted to enter into our suffering. And He did it. God entered our suffering. This coming Sunday in church, it'll be March 12th, March 13th. And we're going to talk about how Jesus is the best friend to come near us because He understands suffering. He may feel far away, but He certainly understands and is able to identify with our suffering. I trust your lament will be sweet today as you offer Him your complaints through faith as a sign and example of worship. Because God is worthy of our worship, and that's giving Him value and lifting Him up and bowing ourselves down for His glory and our good. First Alliance Church is truly a great place to be. If you're in Raleigh, I hope you'll stop by. God bless.